All right, so I watched a YouTube video. It was made by Timothy Gordon. He's a conservative Catholic commentator, and I'm trying to remember what he was talking about. Maybe he was talking about the proofs of God or something like that. And I saw an individual. I forget what name he went by, but he was talking about. He was critiquing the video. Or no, wait. I think I initially asked a question about how does he get from what he's explaining in the video to a particular proof or an explanation for the existence of God or something like that. I wish I remembered the exact context, but I ended up having a back and forth with this individual. And so he was willing to admit that, concerning Big Bang cosmology, I was fine with that. To go back to a particular point. And in his mind, any notion of God was special pleading. Any notion of God. I swear I've gone through this, but I'm going to go through it again because it doesn't look like I have a highlight for it. This kind of jumps into the middle of this discussion. So just understand that this is a conversation between me, who are trying to make Thomistic arguments, and someone who is more inclined to a kind of science of the gaps argument. It's we don't have a scientific explanation for it yet, or may we never, but there must be a naturalistic explanation for it, which is an assumption that comes from his philosophical presuppositions. Right? If he thinks that ultimate reality consists merely of motion, matter, space, and time, and that anything that happens ever must have an explanation within this philosophical framework, then it makes sense that, he would look at me and think, oh, you're just trying to fit God wherever there aren't explanations. And that's not what I'm doing at all. I'm not actually employing any kind of God of the gaps kind of thing, which is we don't have a scientific explanation for it, so therefore God. No, that's not what I'm doing at all. And you'll see that's what he thinks that I'm doing. But I clarify that. So this is what I state. All right. Well, we'll just kind of jump into the middle of the conversation and go from there. Perhaps it is better simply to state that all which is and can be observed, that is, anything observable, and therefore known empirically, is contingent. That if it exists now, it one day will not exist, and at one time did not exist, and therefore requires a necessary being. This is my line of argument. An unmoved mover who moves a thing from merely being potential to being actual. If a thing is not the cause of its own existence, which only nothing comes from nothing, right? Nihil, ex nihil, sit, an axiom of philosophy, but rather receives its existence from another, does not have the power to give existence to something that does not have it, since it does not have it within itself. Therefore, that which is contingent, anything with potentiality, and therefore subject to change, cannot move a thing from potentiality to actuality. All right, so I'm framing. What is the difference here? When do we move from scientific empiricism to having to engage in rationalistic philosophical thought, right? Science has its limits. And once science does its job, right? Once we recognize things that science can observe, things that are observable, even under a microscope, and maybe even things that we cannot observe yet because we just lack the ability to do so, whatever the case may be. My argument, and all of it is, is that it's contingent. Contingent things are a subject of scientific inquiry as far as physics, how and why, and those types of questions, right? All of the realm of science and things that we can consider. But then we also must consider how a contingent thing even is what it is, explanations for its existence, right? Such as the material cause, right? The efficient cause, the formal cause, all these, the Aristotelian explanations for the existence of a thing, right, need to be employed when we're looking at a thing, right? It's contingent, right? So now we have to address these types of questions of how contingent things even exist, because they don't have to exist. They could, but they don't have to. But here we are observing a thing that does exist. How do we explain that? Why is there something rather than nothing, right? So the agnostic replied, energy is observable, and therefore could be known empirically. I agree with that. All the things that we observe come into existence forms by some sort of transformation of energy or a change of some state of process. I think what he's talking about here is that matter can be neither created nor destroyed, is the idea. There's a certain amount of mass in the universe. They may change various states, and so on and so forth. How electromagnetism can cause heat, or one form of energy can be transformed into another, such as water moving turns a turbine, can create electricity, and so on and so forth, right? Anyways, he hasn't said anything here that's problematic here, for me anyways. He then replies to a statement that I made. So, therefore, requires a necessary being, an unmoved mover, who moves a thing from merely being potential to be actual. He says this is a claim that has no support. Well, first of all, there isn't anything in nature and how we know how it functions points to any other explanation for why a thing does what it does. All right, so there isn't any support for there not being anything that's necessary. I think maybe in his mind he's thinking that what is necessary is that which is, right? He's probably one of those proponents of the idea that in a set of a set of contingent things can have an attribute that each of the individual members of that set do not have, right? I don't propose that as an explanation for this. Rather, I'm simply saying is that we have all these contingent things. We need something that's necessary, right? And so it has rationalistic support. It does. So it's not a claim merely. There has to be something necessary, because here we are. Why is there something rather than nothing? You'd have to say that, well, things have always existed. Things are just fluctuating. New universes are exploding into existence, and so on and so forth. I mean, he would have to put his faith in something like that, because he can't observe it. That's no longer science. He can extrapolate, engage in rational extrapolation, but that's what I'm doing as well. I'm trying to address the question of necessity. And so he says, and when you exempt a God from being contingent as a foregone conclusion, this is special pleading. All right, so this is really weird. He's saying I'm exempting God from being contingent, when God is necessary by definition, right? So what I'm saying is there's something that's necessary that doesn't have the attributes of contingency. All right. And I'm saying that, okay, given that there is something contingent, what can we know about this? So there is something that's necessary. What can we know about this necessary thing? And very interestingly enough, philosophically, it has the attributes which we typically have concerning God. So it's not a matter of I'm exempting God from being contingent. What I'm saying is that there are contingent things, and that necessity explains why there's something rather than nothing, why there are contingent things, and that this thing that's necessary must have certain attributes in order for it to be necessary. And these are the attributes we typically think of when we think of God. So it has nothing to do with special pleading. But see, in this case, he simply assumes that everything is contingent, or at least that's what it seems to be the case. Okay. So I say, if we were to use a rational demonstration, right, as to why a chair is contingent, right, we would agree that we are not exempting the chair from being necessary without justified cause. But more accurately, we would rather say that the chair was determined to be contingent and, by logical necessity, is not necessary. Would you agree with this? So you see what I'm doing? I'm trying to establish that you can use rational demonstration why a contingent thing is exempt from being necessary because it's contingent, right? And that's the justified cause, because he keeps using this term special pleading, but he's using it wrong. He's using half of the definition. Unfortunately, we can't do that. All right, this isn't special pleading. We're just reasoning. Now, if he doesn't find it compelling, that's on him. But what I'm talking about is that there is something that's necessary, right? Otherwise, there would always be nothing, right? We have to address that particular issue. And philosophically, we really have to go to something that's necessary that makes things what they are. And I say, would you agree with this? It certainly would be inappropriate to simply assume that a chair is not necessary without a justified cause, that is, without a rational demonstration that determines the nature of the chair, which proves that it is indeed contingent. Yes, this is true. I mean, you would have to prove that the chair is contingent. And there wouldn't be anybody who would disagree with that. I just want you to know, he never addresses this because it cuts counter to his previous comment about me engaging in special pleading of exempting God from contingency. And so I flip it around and I use a chair as an analogy and say, well, wouldn't you say there's justified cause to saying that this chair is exempt? So my argument is there's justified cause, there's rational demonstration, right? Which goes back to that there is necessity. This thing that's necessary must have certain attributes, and these are the attributes we're typically saying concerning God. He continues, what makes a chair is its ability to be sat on. An object is only in its category of object so long as it fulfills its defining use to people. So this is basically the nominalist conception of reality. All right, so for him, there is no objective meaning. There isn't. All right. A thing is only what it is because we are naming it, right? Hence, nominalism. We're giving meaning to it. We're giving it utility. It's useful to us for something, and so therefore it has meaning to it. Otherwise, it's just not a thing, right? Well, once again, this is problematic. He continues, what one person calls a chair, another person might call a rock, a step stool, a doorstop, or to be used to start a fire if made out of flammable material. So he's speaking from within the context of his philosophical perspective, that he's agnostic. He doesn't think. But in this case, he actually moved in order to make these statements, right, to say that we can only project meaning onto meaningless things if there are meaningless things, if there isn't an objective ultimate meaning to things, right? So he's not as agnostic as one might think, right? Because if there's a God, then things have meaning in relation to that God. They are what they are in relation to his knowledge of himself. So he's not an intellectually honest agnostic, because he's making statements that actually follow a line of philosophical reasoning that is substantially atheistic. Well, the materials of this hypothetical chair are necessary, made out of atoms or molecules, which did not form until about 300,000 years after the initial start of the most recent Big Bang event. You see, so he's holding on to a kind of cyclical understanding. All right, or so he's either saying he agrees with that we're going to reach a point where space has been stretched so far, there's going to be a great implosion, right? And that this is what happens, right? Reality just keeps doing this. It collides on itself. That's why there's a condensed point of energy. It explodes again back into this, and you do that an infinite amount of times. You eventually might hit upon an explanation for the theanthropic principle. All right. Or he thinks, as some have also proposed, this idea that that new universes are being born through big bangs on the other side of black holes, so on and so forth. Once again, neither of those things are scientific because neither of them can be actually observed, right? And in fact, it's in Big Bang cosmology in general, most people don't think that there's going to be this kind of big implosion that is going to take place. We're just going to reach a place of heat death where nothing is going to live for all eternity. That's my understanding. So while the chair is contingent, what makes the atoms of the chair is necessary. Now, he's just talking about that there are certain explanations for the existence of the chair. That's all. But he wants to throw in the word necessary as if it somehow explains or encompasses what I'm trying to say is necessary to explain contingency to exist at all, not just this one contingent thing. So he says, and even those atoms are contingent on the events that took place 1/1,000,000th of a second after the Big Bang, which is when gravity, then the strong force, which holds nuclei in atoms together, followed by the weak and electromagnetic forces, started to affect the universe. I mean, basically, he's just kind of spouting off certain aspects of Big Bang cosmology, which I'm familiar with, and it doesn't really come into play in my reasoning concerning necessity, which itself is contingent on a form of energy that can suddenly push out the fabric of space. Now, the trouble is, we do not know for sure what this form of energy actually is or where it came from, but whatever it is, it was necessary to continue the formation of space that we have today. So he's using the term necessary in a different way than I am. He's using it by way of explanation, which I'm fine with in terms of explanation. If he's just giving explanations for, well, why are things this way? What is our present explanation for that, given the things that we have? It doesn't explain why there is something rather than nothing. It doesn't explain why contingent things even exist, right? To postulate, and here it is. This is where he gets it wrong. To postulate that this form of energy is a god or from a god will need some very strong evidence to support the hypothesis. Number one, I never claimed that the highly compacted point of energy that is considered to be the point of the Big Bang is God. No, that's still contingent, right? It moves, it has motion, it's subject to change. All right, it has spatial relationships, so on and so forth. That's not God. All right. So for him to say that I'm at all doing this is certainly wrong. Now, to say from a God, that has to do with the rational demonstration. This is what is evidence. And here's the point. When people use the word evidence, normally what they say is, or what they mean by evidence is empirical evidence, is what they're saying. But that's not the only way of knowing something. There's some can have such a narrow scientific kind of conception of reality where um, evidence is only understood within a context of matter, motion, space, and time, empirical evidence, sense experience, those sorts of things. But that's not the only way of coming to know something. We can engage in philosophical reasoning, right? And so he then goes to say, not some philosophical nonsense. See how dismissive he is. That only gets you to a nebulous God concept that could. Okay, and here's the problem. All right. So number one, he wants evidence for what I'm claiming to be necessity, which, if it's understood as empirical evidence, you're not going to get that, because empirical evidence is for contingent things. We're trying to explain contingent things, and the concept of necessity is what helps us do this, or there would be nothing at all, right? So you had to explain why there's something rather than nothing, and why all the somethings we see are contingent. Right? So we reason from contingency back to something that's necessary. There's something that makes these things exist as opposed to never existing forever, right? There would just literally be nothing forever, because nothing comes from nothing. There has to be some explanation for the existence of contingent things. That's what I'm talking about. All right, it's not philosophical nonsense. And you can see that there's this unwillingness to engage in rational demonstration, an unwillingness to engage in philosophy of a theistic sort. But the thing is, when he says philosophical nonsense, he's a philosopher too. He's philosophizing. All right? There's no such thing as a pure scientific individual, you know, because science really is a branch of philosophy per se. It's employing a certain kind of knowing. You know, when we look at philosophy, we're looking at ethics, we're looking at metaphysics, we're looking at epistemology. We're in the epistemological realm, you know, empiricism is one particular way in which we can come to know something. We can also know things by reason, and so on and so forth. Which is why, so it's subsumed within philosophy. It's the way the philosophers reasoned. You know, before Aristotle wrote his metaphysic, he wrote the physic. Right? He's reasoning from things. Right? It's all philosophy. Right? So calling it philosophical nonsense. And it's not a nebulous God concept. It's quite specific. We can actually know quite a few things, and I go through some reasoning here later in my responses that talk about this very clearly. But then listen to what he says. All right? He says, not some philosophical nonsense that only gets you to a nebulous God concept that could easily be Mboba, Pangu, Brahman, some other creator deity, or even the invisible pink unicorn. Now, once again, there's a problem here. There was a book recommendation by Trent Horn recently called One Less God Than You. And I think part of what Trent was saying is the thesis of the book is all of these other God concepts fall short of fulfilling the definitions of necessity, because these various beings or forces or whatever they are, they're contingent. They change. They're subject to change. And that's not what we're talking about when we talk about necessity. All right. So I respond. Quite lengthy here. In order to keep ourselves from speaking past each other, I will state the following again, because it was a question that I posed to you directly in response to your comment that excluding God from being contingent is special pleading. If we were to use a rational demonstration that a chair is contingent, we would agree that we are not exempting the chair from being necessary without justified cause. But more accurately, we would rather say that the chair was determined to be contingent and by logical necessity is not necessary. Would you agree with this? I can't get a response from him. I was hoping for a response because it would lead into a discussion about special pleading, which I will speak to in this response. If you are arguing against theism as a cogent philosophical system, I would actually recommend against positing other possible gods, beings, imaginary animals, objects, etc. The attempts of Richard Dawkins in his book The God Delusion to critique Aquinas' 5 ways was very weak, and similar critiques along these same lines, I find to exhibit a lack of understanding of exactly what is meant when a monotheist demonstrates God. Just from looking into Mbambo, it says that Mbambo was a giant in form and white in color, and that this being experienced pain in their stomach and vomited out aspects of creation. It also says that this being was alone. Darkness and primordial water covered the earth. Like many of these creation myths, they speak of creation via pre-existing matter, that the being was troubled in some manner, even opposed by the elements, or in conflict with other beings, as we can see with beings like Apsu and Tiamat in Babylonian mythology. Likewise, Pangu is also seen as a hairy giant who has horns on his head. This being was said to have emerged from an egg that formed from a primordial state, created some things, and in this case is said to have died. Brahman is said to be one of the principal deities of Hinduism, and together with Vishnu and Shiva are referred to as Trimurti. It is a henotheistic idea that posits more than one divine being. Depending upon the legend one reads, Brahma is depicted as having created himself in a golden egg, as emerging from the navel of Vishnu, or was born from Shiva, or created by Devi. The invisible pink unicorn is the most ancient being, and its legends predate existence itself. I joke, but this is my favorite. You mentioned special pleading in your original post, and I would agree with you if, for instance, I proposed an invisible pink unicorn and an invisible blue unicorn, but simply stated that the invisible blue unicorn was contingent or non-existent, but that the invisible pink unicorn pre-existed all things and was a necessary being. Why? I like pink. Once again, I joke. This would be a very clear case of special pleading because there is no rational explanation for it. No justification for why the invisible pink unicorn is different than the invisible blue unicorn. I would argue that in each of these creation myths there is a being with some contingent form. I would not argue for any of these myths because, as I stated above, 1. There is primordial matter. Sometimes that primordial state actually brought forth the being. Or 2. Opposed or resisted by the primordial matter, or even their subsequent formations. 3. There are rival beings in which they are in conflict. Much of this is seen in the Roman and Greek pantheons, where human-like beings are born and are in conflict with one another. And of these creation myths, Scripture actually has aspects that are unique, that distinguishes itself from the others. 1. God is the actual creator of all things, and is not rivaled by any other god, because there are no other real gods. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Likewise, he was not born from, nor existed along with, a primordial state of which he was a part. Nor did he take his primordial matter and form it to exist as our universe. 2. He is the ruler over the elements. The Spirit of God was hovering above the waters. He controls, manages, subdues it. He is not in struggle with it, nor does it fight against him. 3. The creator of all beings, animals, etc., God created the great creatures of the sea. God is not in tension against a Leviathan or a behemoth. He would have been the one who created them. It leads me to posit a unique God that exists, that created all contingent things out of nothing. That is, not formed from pre-existent matter, from a primordial state, nor from his own being, which actually has philosophical significance. What makes God more profound of an idea than an invisible pink unicorn is that God has with himself all perfections. And let's be honest, the unicorn is just not very impressive, no matter how pink it is. In other words, God must be subsistent being itself, the necessary cause of all being and contingent things. This is the explanation why there are contingent things. Being subsistent and being necessary, in God, existence and essence is identical. That is, the essence of what God is the explanation for his eternal existence. It is the very nature of his essence to exist, unlike contingent things that have existence given to them by something outside of itself. The answer to why is there something rather than nothing is therefore as simple as there is something that is necessary. Otherwise, nothing would exist. How do we know? Because it is the very nature of contingent things to change, that is, from being to non-being, or from non-being to being, and therefore could not eternally exist, and would therefore direct us to an unchanging, eternal, necessary thing. Otherwise, there would be no one around to ask, why is there nothing at all? It certainly would be special pleading if we were to arbitrarily attribute necessity to one thing among others. But again, that is the point, isn't it? God isn't just another thing among others, as if he belongs to a primordial state or came into being or was in any way contingent, like all of these beings posited by these so-called creation myths. Consider this. An unchanging, eternal, necessary being would be infinitely what he is. That is, his essence does not limit his existence, and therefore there can only be one of what he is, because none other can have that nature. Nor could he share a part of himself through an emanation or any other conception that makes God composite. God must be simple. He must be spirit, in which there is no potentiality. He must be pure actuality. There is this supreme idea in the mind so profound that it has not escaped our notice, and how much greater it is to exist outside of the mind. The agnostic replies. It might be difficult at this point, after my long post, to know exactly where his comments fit in. He says, no, my reply still stands. And once again, he's not answering my question about the contingent chair. He doesn't want to. No. He doesn't care about what Richard Dawkins said, but Thomas's 5 ways have been philosophized to death are not compelling. To him, they're not compelling. Each time someone brings them up, they tend to bring up a refined version that needed to happen due to the first 5 being weak in certain areas. No. His arguments were sufficient for his purposes. When someone brings up a new objection or brings up a new subtle idea that needs to be addressed, then you have to refine the argument in order to address that particular objection. It just becomes more explicit, right, and more refined, that's all. It wasn't because he wasn't reasoning well in the right direction, which he assumes that it's just simply not good, which this would be the case. Each of those deities can be substituted for he in your original claim that a god created the universe. No, see, he's not listening. He's not listening to the rational demonstrations. Not at all. He still thinks that this pig-nosed creature that was born from an egg created the universe. You know, like I'm somehow making some sort of equivalence here. No, that thing's contingent. It does not. It's infinitely. It's contingent and finite and infinitely not what I'm saying at all in the slightest. He's not willing to address the uniqueness of the argument from contingency. He's not willing to grasp what we're referring to as an explanation for all contingent things, of what necessity is. All right. Now, if he wanted to engage that philosophically, that's great, but the fact that he continues to evade it might be a hint that he cannot argue against it. That there aren't strong philosophical reasons why someone ultimately would just simply dismiss the argumentation. He says each one has just as much evidence for creating the universe as the other, and you need to provide a method to filter out any other imaginary being that you or others want to fill in the small gap in knowledge. See, no, I'm not doing God of the gaps. This isn't a gap in knowledge. We're actually reasoning out an explanation for the existence of all things. We're not saying, well, we don't have a naturalistic explanation yet for why the movement of the heavenly bodies, right? So angels must be pushing them around. No, I'm not talking about stuff like that. I'm not talking about everything within nature is going to have a natural explanation for how it functions and how it works, how it moves. There's a physic to it. I'm not talking about science, all right? I'm not talking about the narrow-minded scientism that he's got himself stuck in here that doesn't allow him to reason, all right? He needs to be able to reason. And he still wants to use this idea of evidence, method. See, he's still talking about empirical evidence. He's still talking about like a scientific method. All right? I'm not talking about that. Nor should we expect God to be so small that we can put him underneath a microscope and subject him to physical laws. And that's not a God. If he's thinking that if there's a God, it must be the small, puny thing that we can study under a microscope and therefore have empirical evidence for. But that God would be finite. It would be contingent. It certainly wouldn't have the attributes required in order to be an explanation for the existence of all contingent things. So it's so dismissive and so narrow, he can't get to the point. He says, current understanding of the scientific theory of Big Bang cosmology does show that there was energy, fine, there at the start of this universe. What the universe actually was or how it acted is the small gap in our knowledge that you are trying to fit a deity. Once again, nope. What that energy was, how it acted, those are just contingent things that people can calculate out and do their best with. It's still a contingent thing. I'm not saying that's God. I'm not saying that that I need a non-natural explanation for how the energy worked or be able to identify precisely what it was. I'm not saying the energy was God. I'm not saying that it acted because God was the one that was moving it around or something. No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that God is the explanation for why that even exists. Like, why? See, I'm not saying what it was, which science could tell you. If science can't tell you, okay, fine. It can't tell you. Or how it acted. That's all about physics. That's all about the scientific method and empirical evidence. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about those things at all. Anything subject to that wouldn't be a God. I'm not saying that I'm trying to fit a deity into the small gap of what was it and how it acted, because those two things has nothing to do with a deity. For whatever reason, he's a bad philosopher. I'll say that. I'll just say he's a bad philosopher. You know. This is what he's really looking at is an inability to engage in rational demonstration. An inability because of his scientism. All right, it's an ideological problem. And it's unfortunate because I can agree with everything he has to say with science is fine. We don't know what the energy was, how it acted, all that stuff. Fine. Okay. Big Bang cosmology, fine. Well, whatever. However things work, they work. I don't have to fit God into any of that. You know, things work according to their natural forces and so on and so forth. Whatever. That doesn't tell me anything about whether God is a necessary being who is the explanation for all contingency. Then he tries to say that I don't know what special pleading is, which I argue against him and actually use definitions. In this case, he'll say a special pleading is an informal fallacy wherein one cites something as an exception to a general universal principle. This is the application of a double standard. Now, as I will show you, this is only half of the definition. All right? That is, it's an arbitrary exception, right, without any rational justification for it. But once you can offer rational demonstration, then it's no longer special pleading because it's not arbitrary, right? And I basically already answered this, but for some reason he thinks that God is special pleading, and so therefore he just sticks with it, even though he's given me half definitions and he's reasoning poorly with it. Now he says, well, you would not agree for any of them. They still fit into what you are arguing for. Nope. He's once again he's trying to say that I wouldn't argue for all these other weird creator myth concept things. It doesn't fit into what they're arguing for because I'm not arguing with contingent things, and all of those creation myths do that. I'm not doing that. He says you make a claim, yet offer no reason why the claim should be accepted. That's not true. I've done nothing but reason. Everything I've done is to reason. He said the only evidence of the claim is the writings of Genesis. I don't even need the claims of writings of Genesis. Just classical theism, right? Philosophy, right? And by way of evidence, once again, that we can come up with these arguments as a good start. You don't need the writings of Genesis for that. But I only brought up the argument, I only mentioned Genesis to show how it's juxtaposed from all the other creation myths. There's something very specific philosophically that is being mentioned here. Those books are flawed in their history, science attempts, and also seems to have mixed multiple prior religions into one. Once again, I can't really address that, though what we think of history and how other people do history might be slightly different, but that's besides the point. People in the Old Testament engaging in things that they thought were science has nothing to do whether or not they were right or correct, or whether it's flawed, because just because we find something in Scripture doesn't mean that it makes it fallible. What we're really talking about is what's asserted, right? We're never taught things concerning science, how the heavens go. Their cosmology was completely different. They thought there were waters above the firmament, and so on and so forth. That's irrelevant. It's not a book about science. They're speaking within the context of their cosmology, within the context of their knowledge of the natural world. That has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not the religious truths that are being presented are in fact infallible. Right. And his claim that there are multiple religions there, I mean, the entire Old Testament refutes that there is one God, there are no other gods. Don't even. And here he goes again here. Listen to this. And he says, an all-perfect being would not create a world that it knew would not be perfect. No. So what he basically says, well, if he had a perfect being, well, everything would have to be perfect all the time. But we're not God, right? So we're not going to attribute perfection to things that are not God. So this is a problem. There's a creator-creature distinction. There's an explanation why you can have a plurality of things, as opposed to a monistic worldview where everything is ultimately one, where distinctions really are an illusion of some sort. He says even the claimed fall of man is imperfect and thus not the work of a perfect being. So basically, he's claiming that if God makes something, even man with free will, then man would never choose to do evil. Right? What kind of free will is that? Like I'm never going to act out of ignorance or something. Even it's a weird conception. I mean, you would have to basically try to say that everything is God or something, and the God's corrupted. Heck, I had a friend one time who said everything is God, and what's really going on right now are just different aspects of God manifesting themselves, and all of this creation material thing. This is just God working out the parts of himself that he doesn't like, or some weird concoction. Weird concoction, indeed. He says this is where you start to go on with special pleading. Once again, nope, not special pleading, and I'll respond to that. You give attributes to this being that you have no evidence for. Once again, if you had empirical evidence for it, it wouldn't be a necessary being. Nor have any method to show that the being has those attributes. And by method, he means scientific method. Once again, God's not subject to scientific inquiry in that way because he's not contingent. Scientific inquiry only concerns itself with contingent things. Since we're not talking about a contingent thing, it doesn't apply. Right? We use our intellect. We use our higher reasoning. So basically, he's saying that I have picked my personal choice and then made faulty arguments for why my choice is better in a form of post hoc ergo propter hoc. And once again, no, I'm not doing that. I'm not arbitrarily making an argument for something that I have already concluded. What I'm saying is I think that as an explanation for contingent things, we would need something that's necessary. And I'm just going to read my response because I think it's going to do a lot better job, because my response is quite long here and I have to just read straight through this and then be done. My response: you still have not yet answered my question directly regarding the rational demonstration that a chair is contingent. If rational demonstration is sufficient, then it is not special pleading to exclude the chair from being necessary, because there is sufficient reason that it is not necessary, namely the law of non-contradiction, that a chair cannot both be contingent and necessary. The point of the question is that if a rational demonstration is sufficient to explain that a chair is not necessary, then it logically follows that rational demonstration is sufficient to explain the existence of something that is non-contingent, reasoning from the existence of contingent things, and that this whole constitutes as an evidence, right? I now am using the term evidence in a broader philosophical sense. If rational demonstration can be given that God is necessary, then it is not a matter of special pleading. The rational basis is the justification for its distinction. We need to agree with a definition of special pleading. I am saying that if I were to arbitrarily propose one thing over another without providing adequate justification, then this would be a clear case of special pleading, and in which case I would agree with you that I was in fact doing this. But since I am demonstrating adequate justification, then the case is even more simple. You simply do not wish to follow reason where reason will take you. and you are using the term special pleading to avoid having to address these distinctions. Instead, you are left with having to confound proposed contingent beings found within various myths with a philosophical argument I am making, instead of interacting with what I am saying on its own merit. And let's be honest, regarding the definition of special pleading, which you shared above, that it should be stated as the following. Special pleading is an informal fallacy wherein one cites something as an exception to a general or universal principle, without justifying the special exception. This is the application of a double standard. This is the citation directly from Wiki. So he took out the term without justifying the special exception in this definition. That's not being intellectually honest. What is the source of the definition you are using? Here is another definition, which I alluded to earlier. Applying standards, principles, and or rules to other people or circumstances while making oneself or certain circumstances exempt from the same critical criteria without providing adequate justification. Do you see that qualification in both of those definitions? And yet another. Special pleading occurs when someone dismisses a special case as an exception to a rule without adequate reasons. Once again, that qualifier, his definition has no qualification whatsoever. Don't be afraid of the term special pleading. It doesn't bother me. In each case, you left out the one way for something not to be a case of special pleading, namely that there must be adequate justification or sufficient reason. Otherwise, any and all distinctions which deviate from a norm would be a case of special pleading, in which case the term would be useless and without practical meaning for the purposes it is being used. These proposed contingent beings, that is the ones in the creation myths, right? All right. Would not fit into what I'm arguing specifically because they are contingent. Anything that is contingent, such as a horned giant or a being that dies or a being that had an origin, has a rival, etc., is not a sufficient explanation for all contingency. As I demonstrated before with the question, why is there something rather than nothing? There are only contingent things presently in existence. Presently because there is something that is necessary. A thing in which it is impossible for it not to exist. In other words, it has no potentiality for non-being. Otherwise, there would be nothing at all. All that which is contingent is not sufficient to explain its own existence, precisely because it does not have existence within itself. It has been given existence to it by something outside of itself. What I am saying is that if all that which is contingent is not sufficient reason for its existence, then we must logically look to something that is not contingent for an explanation, and this would be something that exists necessarily. We do not see this in these so-called creation myths because from what I have been shown here is that the myths do not believe in creation at all, at least not creatio ex nihilo, creation from nothing. But they posit some eternal primordial state which was formed by some being which is limited, is born, dies, and therefore contingent. Or it was this being, or the being is used to personify said state, or this state brought about a being, once again contingent. Of course, if there are other myths of this sort which you wish to propose, I'd be more than willing to assess them as well, but for the most part, you will find more of the same. But let me circle back to that which is necessary and determine what must be true of this necessity. It is the nature of a thing that is necessary to have no potentiality for non-being. It would be impossible for it not to exist, and therefore it is eternal, and the primary cause of being in all contingent things. Otherwise, contingent things would not exist. It could not have any of the attributes of contingency, such that it cannot be composite, and therefore must be simple spirit. It must also not be limited in any way of what it is, comprising in perfection what it is, natural to it, Therefore, it could be the only thing with its nature, and it would be infinitely what it is. It would be incorporeal, so it would not have a specific form and therefore beyond empirical observation. This rational demonstration leads us from all which is contingent to something that is necessary, not having any of the attributes of contingent things, and logically, what are the attributes of a thing that necessarily exists? This explanation, which is necessary, pure spirit, eternal, creator of all contingent things, and implies intellect such that this creation produces intellectual beings, and that all which we observe is intelligible, purposely ordered in a manner to be apprehended by an intellect, naturally leads us to wonder what this explanation is. This is exactly what the Catholic Church teaches about God. Your final thought is based on the question, is this the best of all possible worlds? Some point to the existence of imperfection in this world in order to argue that God could not be a perfect being comprised of all perfections, who freely chose to create this world out of his goodness to the exclusion of all other possible worlds. The most obvious question to ask is, what do you consider to be the best of all possible worlds? I will break out of my reading just for a brief moment to think of one of the arguments is that there is truth, there is beauty, and there is goodness, and things participate in these things to one degree or another, but none of them are exemplars like God is, right? He is all good, all knowing, right? He's truth itself, beauty itself. He's goodness itself. Things participate in that to one degree or another, and that's the key, to one degree or another. In order for everything to comprise all perfections within themselves would mean that they are not distinct from God at all. They would be God. They would just be God, plain and simple. So the fact that we participate in these things to various degrees means God could only create a world with imperfections, per se, right? So we should expect imperfections to express themselves often in ways that are not directed towards that perfection, which is God. All right, and this is exactly the realm of free will, the realm of participation, and so on and so forth. All right, I digress, but that was a good thought. If God was the sole cause of every effect, or that the cosmos ultimately is comprised of a single will, then I would certainly agree with you that this world would tell us more about God than it would tell us about ourselves. But while God is the primary cause of being, the basis of our existence and activity, contingent things engage in secondary causation. God, in being the primary cause, is not to be confused with the first cause in a chain of causation, but rather that God is the uncaused cause of all causation itself. God did not create a world in which there was only one will expressing itself through all the merely apparent wills of human beings, who are said to be created in the image and likeness of God, having will and intellect. Rather, the possible world would be one where God truly shares his goodness with others, who in turn can freely participate in that goodness and direct it back to God and towards others. Unlike a necessary being, who always acts in accordance with its own nature, contingent beings can direct their wills toward their proper end or not. It remains possible for contingent things to change for the better or for the worse, to live in accordance with virtue or to degrade itself in vice. Consider this. Can a necessary being create another necessary being? The answer is clearly no, because it is self-contradictory. It's like asking if God can create a square circle. And I will break out of this here just a moment, because it's usually, and unfortunately, people will say, well, if God created the world, then who created God? Well, once again, that question assumes you don't understand what is meant by necessity. All right, and whatever we say about God, if somebody proposes that, well, something created God, well, then that's not God. Right? The buck stops at necessity, and that's the argument for contingency. Right? All right. It is only the nature of contingent things to be moved from non-being to being, from potency to actuality. And this excludes things that are by nature necessary, and therefore pure actuality and subsistent being itself. There is and can only be one thing that is necessary. That means that anything which God creates would be contingent, and those things would have all of the attributes of contingency. Now remember, I talked about before that God would have to be infinitely what he is. So only he could have his own his nature. So he couldn't create something that's distinct from him but also him. That's contrary to the law of non-contradiction. So there can only be one thing that is necessary. That means that anything which God creates would be contingent, and those things would have all of the attributes of contingency. God having created a world of contingency implies that the best of all possible worlds would be one that is contingent and have all the attributes of contingency and all the possible consequences therein, right? To point to a thing done by something contingent, a thing that is possible to a contingent thing, such that it moves from potency to actuality, denotes that all that which is actualized logically excludes the actualization of the contrary. You're doing one thing versus the other. Do you notice that all that which is actualized logically excludes, and here lies the basis of free will. As I asked above, what do you consider to be the best of all possible worlds? I would even ask, what would you accept as an evidence for the existence of God? If he says empirical evidence, well, that I'm sorry, but God would be too small. God wouldn't be able to create everything. He wouldn't be necessary if he was subject to such a thing. It's just by nature. It's not a convenience. It's just philosophical reasoning, Would you claim that the only way you would consider God to be perfect is if he did not create anything at all? Hence, that's the logical question, right? Because if God did create something, it would be all contingent. Especially since if he were to create anything at all, it would be contingent and therefore have all the attributes of contingency, including the potency to do good and to do evil, to direct things towards their natural end or to pervert them, to engage in the practice of virtue or to fall into depravity. Perhaps you are imagining a world in which all contingent things always willed the good and never actualized the potential for evil. I would propose this. It seems very unlikely that everyone, everywhere, and always would always choose to actualize good. And even though it was always possible to actualize evil, it was always avoided. I would argue, 1, that if God were to create at all, it would be contingent. 2, that the nature of contingent things implies that they will not act necessarily, and it would seem highly improbable that we would get the same result from contingent things as if they did act necessarily. It seems more plausible that contingent things would eventually actualize a wide variety of potentiality, perhaps exemplified by various expressions, though in a much more pessimistic manner, such that if it can go wrong, it will go wrong. And again, given enough time, all possible things would become actual. I certainly would not claim that God is somehow imperfect if a contingent thing acts contingently, having the possibility to do a thing or not to do it. Therefore, I disagree with your proposal that a perfect being would not create if the only possible world had the potential to not be perfect. Like I said, you would need to be more specific in what you mean by perfect, because it is the nature of a necessary being to have within himself all perfections. Yet it is the nature of contingent things to be limited, and not be comprised of any perfections at all, and only participating in said attributes, but only to varying degrees. And my final thought here is generally referred to as the what would we name this argument in theodicy, which addresses the problem of evil, right? It's the argument from greater virtue, we'll call it. The argument for greater virtue. Building upon this understanding of the nature of contingent things is the understanding of the potential that is created in contingent things when they are faced with adversity. To use a line from John Wesley's sermon, God's Love to Fallen Man, he says, "Mankind in general have gained, by the fall of Adam, a capacity of attaining more holiness and happiness on earth than it would have been possible for them to attain if Adam had not fallen." Again, he says, "As God's permission of Adam's fall gave all his posterity 1,000 opportunities of suffering, and thereby of exercising all those passive graces which increase both their holiness and happiness, so it gives them opportunity of doing good, in numberless instances of exercising themselves in various good works, which otherwise could not had any being. And what exertion of benevolence, of compassion, of godlike mercy had then been totally prevented." This is absolutely true. This is the argument for greater virtue. Why does God allow suffering? Because the possibility of greater virtue and being able to share in God's holiness to a greater extent, to participate in the divine being in more and deepening ways. We would not know God as a Savior if we would not know forgiveness, nor would we know what it would be like to act heroically in the face of evil. Perhaps the best of all possible worlds is that world in which we have a capacity of attaining more holiness and happiness on earth than it would be possible for them to attain if Adam had not fallen. To finish with the repeat quote of John Wesley there. All right, everybody, we reached the 2-hour mark. Thank you for watching. I'm going to break this video up into various parts, at least 4. And hopefully it enriches your life and gives you more food for thought. So God bless everybody. Thanks for hanging out, and we shall see you again.